What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a 2004 Volkswagen Golf R32. Today on the R32 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your front brakes. We want to talk about some of the reasons why you may want to consider doing that, and as you can see in front of us, we have both the old hardware that came off the car and the new hardware which we're going to be installing, which is a set of Zimmerman rotors and some packet pads along with a new BOA wear sensor, all of which are available on fcpro.com. Now, this car, taking a look at it, doing a visual inspection, we were able to see that the pads had a lot of life left, but there was a little bit of a pulsation coming from the front end and a little bit of chatter from the pads. Now, looking at the pads, a ton of meat left. Looking at the rotors, you can see they are a little bit worse for wear. One of the things you can do when inspecting your car is run your fingers across the front, and if you feel a lip on the inboard or outboard side of the rotor, then they show that they're a little bit worn out. And then if you step on your brakes under heavy braking and you get some pulsation at the steering wheel, more than likely the brakes are warped. But that doesn't mean that you can rule out front suspension wear, as worn out bushings and control arms can also cause that. Now we know this car behind us has a new front end refresh, so likely the brakes just by looking at them. One thing that we don't account for, and it's always good to maybe even take things apart if you're trying to rule out a brake problem, is if something has failed, a rotor has cracked or pads have failed. In this case, the front pads have separated. So here's a normal pad, normal wear, and then here is what was left of the inboard pad, just the backing plate. The actual pad material separated itself from the backing plate, so the second the caliper came off, it all fell apart, which was probably what was causing the chatter. To our left, we have Z-coated Zimmerman rotors, meaning that everything else besides where the pads are going to be touching will not rust. It'll last a little bit longer, so it won't look like this, along with some semi-metallic packet pads. These may last anywhere from 40 to 60,000 miles. It truly depends on the kind of driving you do on your car. But before we get started on this DIY, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. For this job, we're going to be using a 1/2-inch drive torque wrench and a 3/8 drive torque wrench. Same goes for our ratchets. We have both. A small extension may be needed. A flathead screwdriver is always helpful. We have a caliper hook to hang your caliper off to the side. If you don't have a hook, you can use a bungee cord or zip ties if you need to. We're going to be using this Lyle tool to compress our pistons back in. The fronts are dual piston calipers. We're also going to be using some electric impact tools, a wire wheel to clean up some corrosion. We have a 17mm lug bolt socket. We have an 18mm socket, both one's for the 1/2-inch drive, one's for the 3/8 drive, a 7mm hex, a T30, should your car still have set screws for the rotors, and we also have some penetrating fluid and some liquid moly ceramic paste. Now with that, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, we are going to be working on the driver's side of the R32, as this is the side that is equipped with the wear sensor. So that way we can show you how to unplug it, plug it in, all that good stuff. First, we have 5 17mm lug bolts to remove. If you do not have an impact gun, then you want to use a breaker bar with the car on the ground, break them free, and then you can jack it up and remove the lug bolts. Today we're just going to zap them off with the impact gun. 17mm socket. With our wheel off, we have a better view of our rusty and crusty brakes that we're going to be working with. A couple things I like to do first is I like to remove the anti-rattle clip first, and should your car still have it, these have been sheared off at some point in its life, just make sure that you can break free the set screw. What I like to do is I fit my bit in, give it a couple taps with a hammer just to break any rust loose, and then you can go ahead and just crack them free, but leave them on for now just to hold the rotor on. Our car is missing them, so it's going to be more of a balance. What I'm going to do is thread in one lug bolt so that the rotor doesn't fall on me when we take off the caliper carrier. So you can do the same trick at home. So let's start with removing our anti-rattle clip. I like to use a small flathead screwdriver for this. Now these calipers are a little bit worse for wear, so we don't have to worry about marring up the paint on them. But should your calipers be a little bit nicer, then just be a little bit mindful when you take these off. Just prying against the pad. Now with the anti-rattle clip off, we're going to hop into the back, remove the dust caps so we can pull off the 2 7mm hex bolts that hold our caliper to the carrier. I like to use a small flathead screwdriver to just pry off the dust caps on the back. And in our case, you can see our car is missing the brake pad wear sensor. Our electrical connector is right here. The last sensor that was in here, what you saw on the table, was just cut off and spliced together to trigger the light off. But since we are going to be replacing these parts, we're going to go ahead and do the right thing and put on a new sensor. Now we're going to take our 7mm hex tool and just remove the guide pin bolts. And at this point, you can either use the Allen bit to kind of wiggle the guide pin bolt out. What I like to do instead though is take a flathead screwdriver and just from the front, find the guide pin, grab a thread, and just push it back. Make sure you clean these off, wire wheel them if you need to. Just make them nice and smooth before you reinstall them. The top one's a little bit tighter to get to because of the brake hose, but you can squeeze it in. An extension will help. Just make sure it's seated in as best as possible. Now at this point we can work our caliper off. Just be mindful the front pad can fall out, so it's just sitting on the carrier. And while we have you up here, we're going to go ahead and get our caliper ready for our new brake pad and disc. So we're going to go ahead and compress it using our piston tool. So let's go ahead and do that now. I like to use the old pad as a backing plate. We have our tool. I just have some shop towel here. I know these calipers are a little bit worse for wear, but I don't have to add on to these scratches. So a little shop towel there just to hold everything. We'll get this going. These pads, as you can see, were not that worn. So these pistons are not going to go in too far. So it should go in nice and easy. These are nice and bottomed out. We can take our tool off. Now we can go ahead and pop our old pads out. And if you need to, you can clean off the surface of the pistons using maybe some light emery cloth. Just be careful of the seals. We're going to shake any rust that's trapped in there out. And now we can grab our caliper hook and just hang it off our spring coil. The goal here is just to keep any load off of our soft line. Now we can hop in the back and remove the caliper carrier. So let's do that now. I'm going to use an 18mm deep impact socket on a 1/2" ratchet just to break the carrier bolts free. And then we'll switch over to an electric ratchet just to zap them out. There's the top one. Those should be loose enough now where we can go ahead and zap them out with the electric ratchet. If you're going to reuse your bolts, just be sure to clean up the threads. And if you'd like, you can apply a small amount of medium strength thread lock to the threads. Little wire wheel action should clean those up nicely. And we're going to go ahead, take this carrier, set it to the side. What we're looking to clean up here is these channels. This is where the ears of the pads ride. So we'll take some wire wheel, clean this up nicely before we reinstall it. But for now, let's go ahead and remove our brake disc. So my good people, at this point, we'd be taking our T30 and zapping out our set screw. Ours is sheared off. Really the best way to replace that is by replacing the wheel bearing and hub. You can also try drilling it out. I've personally never had luck doing so. So for now, our set screw will be our lug bolts. We're going to go ahead and take this out, get rid of this crusty rotor. It's very important to note that the brake kit includes a left and a right. They are not the same. You want to pay attention to the vanes on the cooling vanes on the disc. Make sure that they're facing the right orientation before you go ahead and throw your brakes on. We have recently been working on this car. As you can see, we have new struts and lowering coils on there. So we just had this off. This has already been cleaned up and there's some liquid moly paste on there. So if you haven't done so already, wire wheel this, emery cloth, whatever you have, clean it up nicely. Now we can grab our new disc and get that situated. We have our hub cleaned up, ready to rock. I'm going to apply some liquid moly ceramic paste. Now, even though Zimmerman does not require anything for the Z-coated rotors, Realistically, we live in New England. This car will see salt. It will inevitably rust. So we're just trying to be mindful and help ourselves for the future. And then again, since we do not have a set screw, we're going to be installing our disc and then using a lug bolt to hold it in place. However, should you still have a set screw, if you're going to torque it down, no more than 8 Newton meters. But with that, we can set our rotor in place, snug it down, and now we can take our carrier, which we have cleaned up, get our two 18mm bolts, and get those started on the back. We get the top bolt started, just so that we can hold everything in place. Might look a little funny, that's because I'm just fighting the brake disc that keeps moving on me over here. I'm just going to zap them in with the electric ratchet. And we're going to torque these down to 125 Newton meters. There's our top one. Now with that, we can install our pads. We're going to install the front pad on the carrier, and we'll install the inboard pad on the brake caliper. Then we'll swing everything over. For our outboard pad, we're going to apply a little bit of paste to the ears, and we're going to sit that onto our carrier. And then on the inboard pad, our brake pad wear sensor is going to be sitting on this notch once we have that installed. But there's a little notch there. I like to put a little bit of paste on these tabs that go into the pistons just to keep them from rusting in place inside of there. Same thing, a little bit of paste on the ears. I'm going to pop this into our brake caliper now. So I'm going to unhook it first. Don't forget to take your caliper hook or hanger off. Get these pads lined up into the pistons on the caliper. Pop them in, and now we can swing our caliper over. Just like so. Now let's hop in back and reinstall our 7mm hex guide pin bolts. Here are guide pins all cleaned up. Dealer's choice if you want to use any paste on these or not. The manual does not require them, but personally I've been doing this for the last 10 years. I like to put a little bit of ceramic paste on them just to help them in and out of these rubber bushings. I'll use the ratchet and the 7mm hex just to get them started, as we don't want to cross thread these by accident. Before we snug that up all the way, I want to make sure we can get the bottom one started. Now we're going to torque these 7mm hex guide pins down to 35 Newton meters. There's the bottom one. Don't forget to put your dust caps back on. The top one has a little holder on it for what I would imagine is the brake pad wear sensor. And then the bottom one's blank. And while I have you there, we'll go ahead and plug in our sensor now. We're going to route that over the top here, just like so. Hook it onto the back of that dust cap. And you want to make sure that the thicker side is facing the pads. That's what's going to wear down over time and eventually trigger the sensor from going off. Clip that into our pad, and I'm just going to use the flathead to secure it all the way in. Beautiful. You can also pop the dust cap on the bleeder valve and tuck the sensor in the little notch that's there. That'll keep it from flapping around. Now we have our caliper bolted up, our pads are in, our brake pad wear sensor's in. All that we have left to do is put our anti-rattle clip back on and our wheel. So let's do that now. Now we're going to go ahead and take our anti-rattle clip, reinstall that. You start at the bottom here, get that clipped in, feed it up top, and just push it in. Now I'm going to pull my lug bolt out. We'll get our wheel on and get it snugged up, making sure our rotor is sitting nice and flush. Make sure you start your lug bolts by hand. The last thing you want to do is cross thread these and not be able to go for a test drive. Then you'll really be doing that wheel bearing and hub. We're just gonna use the Milwaukee to snug it up gently. That way we know the wheel is flush to our hub. And then we'll set it on the ground and torque them down properly. Make sure you always do that in a star pattern. Now with that, let's get this on the ground. We have our torque wrench set to 90 foot-pounds, 120 Newton meters. We're gonna go ahead and snug these down, sticking to that star pattern. And with that, my good people, that is going to conclude this DIY for today. Overall, a really straightforward and easy job on the R32, and definitely a good one to know. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave those in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.